The first time Jennie Holloway told a man she wanted nothing from him, she meant it with every bruised and battered piece of her heart. And the second time she said it, standing in the amber dust of Callow Creek, Texas, with a stranger's dark eyes watching her like she was the most complicated thing he had ever seen, she meant it even more fiercely than the first. It was the spring of 1874, and the town of Callow Creek sat like a stubborn old dog at the edge of the Texas panhandle, too ornery to move and too proud to change. The railroad had bypassed it by a good 12 miles, which meant the town existed on cattle money and cattle pride and very little else. The saloon at the center of Main Street bore a faded sign that read, "The Copper Spur," and on any given evening, you could find a quarter of the town's male population inside it, arguing over cards and whiskey, and whether the new water rights bill out of Austin was going to ruin them all. Jennie Holloway had arrived in Callow Creek 6 weeks before the day she met Henry Barnett, and she had arrived in the way that most women in her situation arrived, quietly, carrying one battered leather trunk and a face that didn't invite questions. She was 24 years old, with brown hair the color of creek mud in autumn and gray eyes that people often described as unsettling, not because they were cold, but because they seemed to see things other eyes missed. She had come from Abilene, and before that from a small farm outside of Wichita, and before that from a place she did not speak of anymore. She had found work at the Callow Creek dry goods store, owned by a stout widow named Mrs. Paulette Greer, who asked only 2 things of her employees: that they could count and that they could lift. Jennie could do both. She slept in the small room above the store, and she kept to herself, and she spent her evenings reading whatever books she could borrow from the minister's wife, because the minister's wife was the only woman in town who seemed to understand that a person could need words the way they needed water. Jennie had been married once. That was the part she did not speak of. His name had been Caleb Holloway, and he had been handsome in the way that certain men are handsome, like a knife that catches the light just right. She had married him at 19, full of hope, and the particular kind of foolishness that lives in a young woman who has been told her whole life that love is the thing she should want most. Caleb had been charming for 11 months, and then he had simply stopped being charming, the way a river stops being gentle when the spring floods come. She had left him 3 years later, which was not a simple thing to do in 1871, and which had cost her things she was still adding up. The divorce had been granted on grounds of abandonment, which was the easiest legal path and the least humiliating, though humiliation had followed her anyway like a shadow with nowhere better to be. Her family in Wichita had received the news with the kind of quiet disappointment that was somehow worse than outright anger. She had packed her trunk and she had gone, and she had told herself, in the firm and reasonable voice she used when she was trying to convince herself of something, that she would never again make herself small enough to fit inside someone else's expectations of what she ought to be. She was done with promises. She was done with men who made them. Henry Barnett came into Mrs. Greer's dry goods store on a Thursday morning in April, when the wind was doing what Texas wind does in April, which is to say, it was blowing hard enough to make the whole world feel like an argument. He came in behind a gust of red dust, caught the door before it could slam, and stood there for a moment shaking the dirt off his hat with the particular patience of a man who had learned a long time ago that fighting the weather was a waste of energy. He was 27 years old, tall in the lean way of men who work hard and eat when they can, with dark hair and the kind of jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. His hands were rough and his boots were worn, and there was a quality about him that Jennie noticed immediately and tried not to, which was that he seemed genuinely unhurried. Most men who came through that door moved like they were late for something. Henry Barnett moved like time was a companion rather than an enemy. He worked for the Dunmore Ranch, which was the largest cattle operation in the county, about 8 miles east of town. He had been hired on 2 years prior as a trail hand, and had worked his way to being something between a foreman and a jack-of-all-trades. the kind of man the ranch owner, old Gerald Dunmore, called on when something complicated needed to be done without any fuss. He was buying fence supplies and a new coil of rope and a bag of coffee beans that the cook at the bunkhouse insisted had to come from Mrs. Greer's specifically, because she ordered from a supplier in San Antonio who roasted them darker. Jennie was behind the counter when he came in. She watched him look around the store with the methodical attention of a man who keeps mental lists, and then he came to the counter and set his list on the wood between them and looked at her directly and said, "Morning. Are you Mrs. Greer?" "No," Jennie said. "Mrs. Greer is in the back." "I can wait," he said, and then he didn't say anything else. Most men who stood at that counter while waiting felt the need to fill the silence. They made observations about the weather or asked where she was from or said something they thought was charming. Henry Barnett simply stood with his hat in his hands and looked at the wall of shelves behind her with the calm expression of a man who was accustomed to waiting for things. Jennie found herself watching him from the corner of her eye while she wrapped a parcel of nails for another customer. There was nothing overtly remarkable about him except for that stillness. In a town full of men who were loud in one way or another, who wore their needs and their ambitions like advertisements, there was something almost startling about a man who simply existed in a room without demanding that the room rearrange itself around him. Mrs. Greer came out from the back and handled his order with the efficient warmth she brought to everything, and Henry Barnett paid what he owed and thanked her and nodded once to Jennie on his way out the door. That was all. It was not a significant event, except that he came back the following Thursday and the Thursday after that. The second time, Mrs. Greer was genuinely in the back, occupied with a delivery argument with a supplier, and Jennie handled the order herself. She had the coffee and the rest of his list assembled before he finished telling her what he needed, because she had remembered it from the week before, which she told herself was simply good professional memory and had nothing to do with him specifically. He noticed, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "You remembered all that." "I remember most orders," she said, which was not entirely true. She remembered his. The third time he came, he asked her name. She told him. He told her his. They spoke for perhaps 4 minutes about the fence post shortage that was making life difficult for every rancher in the county, and then he left. Jennie thought about that conversation for the rest of the afternoon and was irritated at herself for doing so. By the 5th Thursday, she had started watching for the particular shape of his horse, a big gray quarter horse named Callow, at the hitching post outside the store window. She did not acknowledge this to herself in any direct way. The thing that changed everything happened at the Callow Creek Spring Social, which was held in the first week of May in the large field behind the church. These socials were the lifeblood of small towns, the place where business was discussed and gossip was traded, and the young people were supposed to take stock of each other under the watchful eyes of mothers and ministers. Jennie had not planned to attend. She had, in fact, told Mrs. Greer that she didn't see the point, which made Mrs. Greer give her the particular look she reserved for things she considered both foolish and fixable. "You cannot hide from the entire town forever," Mrs. Greer said. "People will only imagine worse things than whatever truth you're protecting." So Jennie went, wearing her second-best dress and the expression of a woman who has agreed to something against her better judgment. She stood near the table of preserved goods that the church women had arranged with great pride, and she ate a piece of dried apple cake and watched the fiddle players tune up and felt, with a clarity that was almost painful, that she did not belong to this particular current of life. These people had roots here. They had histories and kin and futures that ran in straight lines toward things they could picture clearly. Jennie's future was a blank piece of paper, and she had started to think that was the only kind she could trust. Henry Barnett arrived with a group of men from the Dunmore Ranch, and he found her by the simple mechanism of looking for her, which she understood from the directness with which his gaze crossed the crowd and settled on her. He walked over with no pretense, no circling, no casual approach designed to look accidental. "Miss Holloway," he said. "Mr. Barnett," she said. "Will you dance?" She should have said no. She had intended to say no. What came out of her mouth was, "One dance," which she immediately recognized as the most dangerous kind of agreement because it implied there was a limit, and limits, in her experience, were the first things to be crossed. He danced the way he did everything, with a quiet competence that didn't call attention to itself. He kept a proper distance, and he didn't try to use the proximity to lean in and say things he thought were interesting. He just danced, and when the music stopped he thanked her and stood beside her for a moment looking out at the crowd, and then he said, perfectly simply, "I'd like to call on you if that would be agreeable." Jennie looked at him. She looked at him with the full force of her gray eyes, and she said, in the measured voice she used for things she needed to mean completely, "I appreciate that, Mr. Barnett, but I want to be clear with you before anything else. I am not looking for courtship. I'm not looking for promises. I had a marriage once, and what it taught me is that promises are just words men say before things get difficult. I don't want them, and I don't need them. If you are looking for a woman to court and propose to and build a life with, I am sincerely the wrong woman, and you would save us both considerable trouble by understanding that now." She had said versions of this before, to the two men who had tried to court her since her arrival in Callow Creek. Both of them had heard it and retreated, and she had felt the clean satisfaction of a thing done correctly. Henry Barnett listened to all of it with the same unhurried attention he brought to everything. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I hear you." "Good," she said. "I'd still like to spend time in your company," he said. "No promises, I understand." She looked at him a moment longer. There was nothing in his face that suggested he was humoring her or planning to convince her otherwise or waiting for her to soften. He simply meant what he said. "All right," she heard herself say. He made her a promise anyway. Not that day. That day he simply walked her back to Mrs. Greer's store after the social ended, and they talked about the cattle market and the drought that was rumored to be coming, and the quality of the spring water near the creek this year. He shook her hand at the door and rode away on his gray horse, and Jennie stood in the doorway watching him go and thought, in the most honest corner of her mind, that she was already in more trouble than she'd intended. He made the promise 6 weeks later, on a warm June evening when they had fallen into the habit of walking along the east bank of Callow Creek on Saturday evenings, which was the one evening she finished work early, and he could ride in from the ranch without it looking like he'd planned his whole week around seeing her, which he had, but that was his private business. They had been talking about her time in Abilene, and she had let slip more than she meant to about Caleb, not the details, but the shape of it, the way a person will sometimes reveal the outline of a wound while trying to convince you they don't have one. Henry had listened without interrupting and without the particular sympathetic expression that made her feel like a problem to be solved. When she trailed off, he picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the creek's surface with the ease of long practice. "You know what I think," he said. "I expect you're going to tell me. I think you're one of the bravest people I've met in Texas, and I've met a good number. And I think whoever made you believe your own bravery was something to be ashamed of was a man who couldn't handle being next to something that outmatched him." Jennie was quiet. The creek made its low sound between the banks. "I told you I didn't want promises," she said, eventually, because it was the only thing she could think of that was true and also protective. "I know what you told me," he said. He looked at her directly, in the way he had that she had come to understand was just his honest nature and not any kind of performance. "And I'm not going to make you one you didn't ask for, but I'm going to tell you something true, because I think you deserve truth more than you deserve comfort. I'm going to keep showing up, Jennie. Not because I think you need saving, or because I've got something to prove, or because I think I can change your mind. But because I've never in my life met anyone whose company felt like," he stopped, seemed to search for the right word. "Like rest," he said finally. "Being with you is the first time I've felt like I could stop moving and it would be all right." She didn't say anything for a long time. "That's not a promise," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's just the truth." But later, When she was lying awake in her room above the dry goods store, listening to the wind and the distant sound of the saloon, she turned his words over in her mind with the careful attention she gave to things she couldn't stop thinking about. And she understood that he had made her something far more dangerous than a promise. He had made her a statement of intent, which was a promise with no performance attached, which was the only kind she might have been able to believe in if she let herself. Summer in Callow Creek was its own kind of trial. The heat came down on the town like a flat iron on cotton, and the dust got into everything, and the cattle drives that pushed through every few weeks left the main street smelling of manure and commerce for days afterward. Jennie learned the rhythms of the town, the way water learns the rhythms of stone, by being in contact with it long enough for both to leave a mark. She got to know people she had initially only nodded at. There was Augustin Reyes, who ran the town's only blacksmith operation and spoke with a formality of diction that suggested he had been educated somewhere far from Texas before a series of circumstances had brought him here. He had arrived from San Antonio with his family and a reputation for making the strongest horseshoes in the county. There was Martha Delacroix, the school teacher, a sharp-featured woman of 30 who had opinions about everything and shared them with a generosity that could be exhausting and was also, Jennie came to think, one of the most honest things about her. There was the minister, Reverend Aldous Prout, who was kinder than ministers often managed to be and who had a dog named after a biblical figure that no one in town could remember correctly, and so they all called it something different. And there was Henry, who showed up every Thursday at the store and every Saturday evening at the creek, as regular as weather and twice as certain. It was August when Gerald Dunmore, the ranch owner, decided to send a small drive up through the Oklahoma Territory to meet a buyer in Caldwell, Kansas, and Henry was tapped to lead it. He would be gone 6 to 8 weeks. He came to the store on the Wednesday before he left and stood at the counter and told her plainly, 6 to 8 weeks, Jennie repeated, maybe less if the weather cooperates and the cattle don't get any ideas. She arranged a bolt of calico that did not need arranging. You'll need to keep your water well rationed through the southern stretch. It's been dry. I know, he said. Jennie, she looked up. I'm going to come back, he said. I know you intend to, she said, and meant it, and also meant the careful distinction she was drawing between intention and outcome, because she had learned that distinction the hard way. I'm going to come back, he said again, and there was something in the way he said it, quiet and sure and entirely without drama, that made it feel different from the declaration she had heard before. It felt less like a vow and more like a weather report, a simple statement of what was going to happen. She wanted to tell him not to say things like that. Instead, she said, I'll have your coffee order ready when you do. He smiled at that, fully and genuinely, and it changed his whole face in a way that she had seen precisely 6 times now and counted without meaning to. He put his hat on, nodded once, and left. He was gone for 7 weeks. Jennie did not think about him every day. She thought about him most days, which was different, and she occupied the rest of her thinking with the work of the store and the books she borrowed and the growing network of relationships she was building in spite of herself. The drive went well. A letter reached her at the store in the 6th week, forwarded from the ranch. He had sent it to the ranch, which meant he'd had to ask someone there to pass it along to her, which meant everyone at the Dunmore Ranch knew he was writing to the woman at Mrs. Greer's store, which was a kind of declaration in itself. The letter was short and direct, describing the territory, the condition of the herd, the particular misery of 2 days of Oklahoma rain in a canvas bedroll. At the bottom he wrote, I told you I would come back. I expect to be in Callow Creek by the 2nd week of September. I think about our Saturday evenings more than is probably practical. She read it twice and then folded it and put it in the small cedar box under her bed where she kept the few things she wanted to keep. He came back in the 1st week of September, which was earlier than he'd said, which meant he had pushed the pace. He came into the store on a Thursday with trail dust in every crease of his clothes and the look of a man who has been moving hard toward something. He was thinner than when he'd left, and he'd grown a beard that suited him in the way beards sometimes do on men who usually go without. "You're back early," Jennie said. "I am," he said. "How was the herd?" "Good, sold well. Dunmore's pleased." He set his hat on the counter and looked at her. "I missed our Saturdays." "Henry," she said in the warning tone. "I'm not making a promise," he said, and the steadiness of it made her close her mouth on whatever she had been going to say next. "I'm just telling you a true thing." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she turned and went to the shelf where she had put aside his coffee beans 6 weeks ago, because she had ordered them ahead of time on account of being certain he would be back when he said, or close to it, and she set the bag on the counter without a word. He looked at the bag, and then he looked at her, and the understanding that passed between them was not spoken and did not need to be. "Same time Saturday?" he asked. "I'll be at the creek at 6, she said. September in Texas was a mercy. After August, the heat lost its personal quality, became something you could negotiate with rather than something that was simply defeating you. The evenings by the creek turned gold and long, and they walked farther than they had in the summer, following the bank east to where a stand of cottonwood trees made a green cathedral of themselves above the water. They had stopped pretending their Saturday walks were casual. One evening she told him about Caleb, not the outline, the substance. She told him about the farm and the way things had started, and the way they had changed, methodically and without drama, like furniture being moved from one room to another over a long period of time, until you looked around one day and nothing was where it had been. She told him about the smallness she had felt, not the dramatic smallness of obvious cruelty, but the slow, deliberate smallness of being told in 100 small ways that her ideas were too large and her opinions were inconvenient, and her needs were a tax that no one had agreed to pay. Henry listened to all of it, and when she was done he said, "Where is he now?" "Abilene, last I heard," she said. "Remarried, someone younger." "I'm sorry," Henry said, and she heard in it that he was not sorry in the way people say sorry when they are simply filling space. He was sorry in the specific way that means, "I understand what this cost you and I wish it hadn't." "I learned things," she said, "about what I'm worth and what I'm not willing to trade." "That seems like an expensive education," he said. "The most important ones usually are." They sat for a while in the sound of the water and the early insects of September. Then Henry said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever you answer is the right answer." She looked at him. "Would it be all right if I courted you?" he said. "Properly. Not to get to something. Not toward any particular end that I'm expecting you to sign on to. Just because I want to know you better and I want you to know me, and I want it to be honest rather than us pretending our Saturdays are something other than what they are." It was quiet for a long time. The cottonwoods moved overhead. "What are they?" she said. "Our Saturdays." He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything. "The best part of my week," he said. She felt something shift in her chest, some weight that had been very carefully placed to hold other things in position, and she felt it move not all the way out but sideways just enough. "I told you I don't want promises," she said. "I know. And I meant it. I know that too." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I suppose honest is always better than pretending." He didn't press it. He simply nodded, and they walked back along the creek as the evening turned dark blue above the cottonwoods, and she was aware of the distance between them, how it had been so carefully maintained, and how it felt now like a choice rather than a requirement. It was October when he took her to see the plot of land. He had not mentioned it before, and she found out about it the way she found out about most things in Callow Creek, which was through Mrs. Greer, who had a network of information that rivaled any telegraph line in the territory. "That Barnett boy has put in an offer on the old Carver homestead," Mrs. Greer said one morning over their inventory. "The 40 acres east of the creek." Jennie kept her face still and her hands moving on the ledger. "Is that so? Dunmore's been offering him a stake for 2 years and he's finally taken it, built himself up enough of a wage to cover the rest. Smart piece of land, that one. Good water access, good pasture. Mrs. Greer paused in the particular way she had when she was saying something she wanted to say but was giving the other person room to respond. He'll need to build a house eventually. Mrs. Greer, Jennie said. I'm just making conversation, Mrs. Greer said, in the tone of a woman who was absolutely not just making conversation. Henry told her about it himself on the following Saturday. He told her plainly, the way he told her everything without dressing it up or down. He'd been saving for 2 years. The land was good. He wanted to build something of his own rather than hire out his life to someone else's operation indefinitely. He showed her the deed with the quiet pride of a man who has earned something specific. "Will you ride out and see it?" he asked. She rode out the following Sunday, which was the only day of the week Mrs. Greer closed the store and declared herself unavailable. The Carver homestead was 42 acres of rolling Texas grassland with a line of cottonwoods along the eastern edge where Callow Creek bent, and a good deep well that the previous family had left behind when they'd gone back east. The old Carver house was a 2-room structure with a leaking roof and a front porch that had given up on one of its posts, but the bones were solid. Henry walked her around the property with the patient attention of a man describing something he loves, pointing out where the grass grew greenest in the dry months, and how the hill on the north side would break the worst of the winter wind, and where a proper barn could be built without crowding the house. Jennie stood on the broken porch and looked out at the grassland that rolled away to the south and felt, with a sudden and disorienting clarity, that she could see it. The rebuilt porch, the repaired roof, the kitchen garden along the south wall where the sun would be best. She could see it so clearly that it frightened her, and she stepped off the porch and walked a few paces into the grass as if putting distance between herself and the vision would make it less insistent. Henry came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. "It's good land," she said. "It is," he said. "You'll work hard on it." "I intend to." She was quiet for another moment, and then she turned and looked at him with the full directness she had learned to use when she needed to say something honest. "I'm not ready to be what you might want me to be on this land," she said. "I want you to know that clearly. Whatever you're imagining when you imagine this place finished, I can't be a piece of that picture that you're relying on." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she didn't expect. "I know," he said, "and I'm not asking you to be. I showed you this because I wanted to share it with you. Because you're the person whose opinion on it I cared most about hearing." He met her eyes and his were steady and clear. "But Jennie, I'll tell you something. And this is the one thing I'll say that's as close to a promise as I'll make since you've told me you don't want them." He paused. "I'm going to be here on this land working it. And whatever you decide about your own life and where you want it to go, I'll still be here. That's not a claim on you, it's just me, where I'll be." She looked at him for a long time and then she looked back at the land. "That," she said, "is the most infuriating promise I have ever heard." He laughed genuinely, without restraint, and it was so unexpected and so warm that she found herself laughing too, there in the October grass with the cottonwoods rattling in the wind and the empty old Carver house behind them waiting to be something again. Winter came to Callow Creek with the particular severity of a Texas winter that has decided to be serious about itself for once. The creek froze along its edges, and the wind came down from the north with nothing to stop it for 1,000 miles, and the cattle huddled in the low places, and the people in town wore everything they owned at once and moved quickly between warm buildings. Henry was busy with the land. He had taken on help from 2 men who wintered in Callow Creek between drives. A quiet Tejano vaquero named Emilio Casas, who had been moving cattle through Texas his whole life, and whose knowledge of the land was encyclopedic, and a broad-shouldered former soldier named Walt Griggs who could put up fence and cut wood at a rate that seemed to violate common sense. Together they repaired the Carver house roof and shored up the porch and began the foundation work for the barn, doing what could be done in the cold. Henry came into the store less frequently in winter because the road between his land and town was a miserable stretch in ice, But he came when he could, and Jennie found that his absence in any given week had a weight to it that she no longer pretended was simply the absence of a customer. Something had shifted between them so gradually that she could not have identified the day it happened, but she understood it now as a fact, the way you understand that a season has changed not by any single morning, but by the accumulated evidence of many mornings. She had feelings for Henry Barnett. Real ones, the specific kind that are made of knowing rather than wanting feelings built from 7 months of Thursday mornings and Saturday evenings, and one cold October afternoon in October grass, where a man had said the most careful and considered not quite promise she had ever been offered. She was terrified of these feelings in the way she was terrified of all things that she could lose. In January, Callow Creek had an incident. This was not uncommon. The town sat along a route that various parties used as a convenience, and its single marshal, a steady man named Ben Colquitt, operated with the awareness that his was a small authority in a large landscape. A group of men passing through cattle buyers of the rougher type, the kind whose business arrangements lived in a gray area between commerce and coercion, stayed 2 nights at the saloon, and in that time managed to start 3 separate disputes and break 2 chairs and intimidate 3 merchants into selling goods at below their asking price, which was a low-grade form of robbery that was difficult to prosecute. Jennie was one of the merchants. They had come into Mrs. Greer's store demanding goods at prices that made no sense, and one of them, a wide man with small pale eyes and the bearing of someone who had spent a long time being the largest person in every room, had leaned over her counter in a way that was meant to remind her of his size relative to hers. Jennie had told him what things cost. He had told her what he was willing to pay, which was less, and looked at her in a way that was meant to communicate that the conversation was over. She had sold him what he wanted at her price, because she was practical and also because she had looked at the odds and judged them correctly, and he had paid it with the expression of a man who was filing away the transaction for later resentment. The men left the next morning, which was a relief to the whole town. Henry heard about it from Emilio, who had a cousin in town who had seen what happened, and he rode in the same day. He found Jennie in the back of the store taking inventory with the focused calm she brought to things she decided not to let upset her. "I heard what happened," he said. "They're gone," she said. "I know. Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly fine." She checked something against her ledger. "He paid full price." Henry was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at her with that careful attention of his. "Jennie," he said. "Henry," she said in the same tone. "Is there anything I can do?" She looked up from the ledger. His face held nothing but the sincere question, no anger on her behalf that he was trying to perform, no masculine urgency to fix a thing that wasn't broken. Just the question. "You could tell Emilio I said thank you for letting you know," she said. "But I am fine, I handled it." "I know you did," he said. "I wasn't suggesting otherwise." She looked at him a moment longer, and then something in her chest released very slightly, and she said, "It did shake me a little. I didn't let it show." "I know that too," he said. They stood in the inventory of Mrs. Greer's back room for a moment, and then Jennie set down her ledger and said, "Will you stay for supper? Mrs. Greer makes a stew on Thursdays, and there's always too much." Henry stayed for supper. He stayed until the evening got late enough that riding back to the ranch in the dark was inadvisable, and Emilio, who had come into town with him, was already bedded down at the livery. Henry slept in the chair by the stove in Mrs. Greer's front room, which Mrs. Greer herself had suggested with the entirely transparent benevolence of a woman who is accomplishing something she has decided needs accomplishing. In the morning before he left, Jennie gave him the letter. She had written it the previous night after everyone else had gone to sleep, sitting at the small table in her room with a candle and the particular recklessness that late winter nights can produce. It was not a long letter. It said, "I am aware that I said I did not want promises, and I meant it when I said it, and I believe I was right to say it. But I have come to understand that what I actually did not want was empty promises, which is a different thing. I find that your company is the thing in my week I look forward to most, and that your absence from a Thursday feels like a miscalculation in the arithmetic of the week. I am telling you this because I have decided that honesty requires it, not because I have changed my position on anything. I still don't want promises. I just wanted you to know that the arithmetic has changed. He read it standing in the cold doorway of Mrs. Greer's store while his horse stamped in the street. He read it once and then he folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, except that she could see in it something like relief, which she understood was the relief of a man who has been patient for a long time and has finally been told the patience is not being wasted. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "Don't make it into something large," she said. "I won't," he said. "But Jennie, just so you know, for me, the arithmetic is entirely in your favor." He left. She stood in the doorway in the January cold until he was out of sight. Spring came back to Callow Creek. With the extravagance it always brought wildflowers in colors that seemed improbable after the gray of winter, the creek running full and vocal, the cattle moving in a restlessness that matched the restlessness of everything else. Henry's barn was framed and sided by March, a proper structure that Emilio said was built better than most he'd seen in Texas, which was significant praise from a man who had seen most of Texas. The Saturday walks resumed, and they were different now. Not changed in any visible way, they still walked the same creek bank, still talked about the same range of things from the practical to the philosophical to the occasionally absurd. But there was something settled in the air between them, something that had been permission-shaped all along and now had permission filling it. He held her hand on the third Saturday of April. He didn't announce it or make a moment of it. He simply reached and she simply let him, and they walked along the creek bank in the late afternoon with their hands together, and the cottonwoods turning their new spring leaves overhead, and it felt to Jennie, with a wonder she didn't expect, like the most natural thing she had ever allowed. They talked about their families that spring, which was territory neither of them had explored much before. Henry had grown up in Missouri, the second of 4 children born to a farmer who worked hard and loved his family well and died of a fever when Henry was 16, leaving the family to manage as best it could. The eldest, a brother named Samuel, had taken over the farm. Henry had worked it for 2 years and then, at 18, with the particular pull of a young man who needs to find the shape of his own life, he had headed south and west, working various ranch operations across Missouri and Arkansas and into Texas, building skills and saving money and looking for something he hadn't been able to name exactly, until he bought his 42 acres and put the deed in his pocket. Jennie told him about her parents, who still lived in Wichita in the careful silence of people who had accepted a situation they were not entirely comfortable with but had stopped arguing about. She told him about her younger sister, Clara, who had married a schoolteacher and moved to Lawrence and wrote letters that were warm and newsy, and carefully avoided the subject of Caleb. She told him, with more lightness than she'd been able to manage before, about the particular relief she had felt the day she'd stepped onto the train that carried her away from Abilene. Not happiness, exactly, but the peculiar freedom that comes from having made a decision that is right even when it is costly. "Do you ever regret leaving?" he asked. "No," she said without hesitation. "I regret that I had to. Those are different things." "They are," he agreed. On a Sunday in late May, Gerald Dunmore rode out to Henry's land to look at the progress, and, in the way that Gerald Dunmore did everything, to make a proposition. Gerald was a man of 70 who had built his ranch from scrub and stubbornness over 40 years, and who had a sharp, clear eye for other people's capability. He wanted Henry to consider a formal partnership, not employment any longer, but a proper business arrangement in which Henry managed a portion of the Dunmore herd on a percentage basis, while running his own operation on his 42 acres. It was a generous offer and a smart one, and Henry told Gerald he would think about it. He told Jennie about it that Saturday. "What do you think?" she asked. He looked at her with slight surprise, as if the question was unexpected, and then she understood that what surprised him was that she had asked what he thought rather than offering her opinion first, and that what she had actually been asking was, "What do you want?" "I think Dunmore's a fair man and a good rancher, and it would be a real opportunity," Henry said. "I also think I want to make sure I can stand on my own land before I tie my interests to someone else's." "How long before you'd feel confident of that?" she asked. "2 seasons, maybe 3, he said, "if the weather cooperates." "Then tell Dunmore you'll revisit in 2 seasons, she said. "He'll understand that better than you think. Men who built things themselves always respect other men who want to build their own." Henry looked at her for a moment. "You're remarkable, you know," he said. "I'm practical," she said. "Among other things," he said. Summer of 1875. Callow Creek acquired a second saloon, which the Reverend Prout viewed with resigned theology, and a proper doctor, which everyone else viewed with enormous relief, because the nearest physician had previously been 16 miles away in the county seat. The doctor's name was Dr. Emmett Farrow, a lanky man from Nashville who had come west for reasons he described as medical but which most people in town suspected were more personal. He set up a modest practice in a building next to the blacksmith and immediately became indispensable, which is the trajectory of all good country doctors. Henry spent the summer building. He had taken on a permanent hand on his land Emilio's cousin, a young man named Louis Casas who was 20 years old and had his cousin's instinctive feel for cattle and land, and who was efficient and good-humored and brought his mother's tamales to the property every Sunday, which Henry said was worth twice the wage. The ranch was beginning to look like what Henry had seen in his head when he'd first walked the land, the barn solid, and weathered to the right degree, the pasture fenced and managed, a small vegetable garden along the south wall that Jennie had suggested and helped plant on a warm May afternoon with her sleeves rolled up in dirt on her hands, and an expression of focused satisfaction that Henry had never forgotten. He had never forgotten the garden afternoon, and he thought about it in the quiet evenings when Louis had gone to the bunk he'd made in the barn, and the Texas night was so large and so present above the land, and Henry sat on his repaired porch and understood, in the simple way of a man who knows his own mind, that he was deeply in love with Jennie Holloway. He had been for some time. He had not told her this because he understood the terrain well enough to know that certain things had to be approached with patience and care, and because the telling of it was not the point. The living of it was the point, and he was living it as well as he knew how. Jennie came to the land more often as the summer went on. Some Sundays she would ride out on the gentle roan mare she borrowed from the livery, and she and Henry would work side by side on some task, the garden, or the organization of the supply shed, or simply the walking of the fence line to check for breaks. She was good company in the working way, which is a specific kind of good company that is rarer than people know. The kind that doesn't need conversation to make itself comfortable, but also makes conversation when it wants to, naturally and without agenda. Louis Casas watched them with the philosophical appreciation of a young man who understood he was in the presence of something significant and had the wisdom to give it room. In August, a letter came from Jennie's sister Clara. Clara and her husband were coming through Texas. Her husband had been offered a teaching position in Galveston, and they were making the trip by stage, and Clara had written to ask if they might stop in Callow Creek for a few days. Jennie wrote back immediately saying yes, and spent the 2 weeks before their arrival doing things she didn't entirely admit to herself, like making sure her room above the store was particularly tidy, and acquiring a new length of blue calico from Mrs. Greer's stock at her employee discount. Clara arrived and was everything Jennie had remembered, small and bright-eyed, and full of the particular energy of a person who finds people genuinely interesting. Clara's husband Thomas was steady and kind in the way of schoolteachers who have been doing it long enough to have learned patience. They stayed 3 days, sleeping in the room that the Reverend Prout's family kept for travelers. Clara met Henry on the second day, when he rode in on Canal for his Thursday supplies, and Jennie, who had not precisely planned for this moment but had perhaps been aware it might happen, introduced them with the deliberate casualness of a woman who has thought carefully about how casual to be. Clara shook Henry's hand and looked at him with the direct assessment of a sister, and then looked at Jennie with an expression that communicated a great deal in approximately no time at all. That evening, when Henry had gone and Thomas had retired early, Clara and Jennie sat on the steps outside the store in the warm Texas night, and Clara said, without any preamble, "He is completely in love with you." "He hasn't said so," Jennie said. "Jennie," Clara said. "I know," Jennie said more quietly. "He looks at you the way someone looks at the only good thing in the room," Clara said. "Not possessively, just attentively, like he's making sure you're still there." Jennie was quiet. "And you," Clara said carefully, "look at him the way you used to look at the creek behind Mama's house when we were small, like something you wanted to jump into but weren't sure was safe." "That's a strange comparison," Jennie said. "You always did jump in eventually," Clara said. They sat a while longer in the night. Then Jennie said, "I told him I didn't want promises." "I know," Clara said. "You've told me. You told me 3 letters ago and 2 letters ago and last month. I meant it." "I believe you meant it when you said it," Clara said with the gentleness of a person who loves someone well enough to push. "But Jennie, Caleb was one man. He was a bad one. Henry Barnett doesn't look like any version of Caleb I can imagine." "No," Jennie agreed. "He doesn't. So what are you protecting yourself from?" The question sat there in the summer night between them, and Jennie didn't have an immediate answer for it, which told her something. She had been afraid for so long that the fear had become its own kind of architecture. She had built her life inside it, comfortable with its walls because at least she knew where the walls were. The idea of stepping outside them was not painful so much as it was disorienting, like trying to navigate a room with all the furniture moved. Clara left the next morning with Thomas and the southbound stage, and she hugged Jennie on the street in front of the store and said against her hair, "You deserve to be loved by someone good. Let yourself have it." The following Saturday, Jennie arrived at the creek early. Henry was already there, standing on the bank watching the water with his particular quality of stillness, and he turned when he heard her horse, and he looked at her in the way Clara had described, which she now saw entirely clearly, the careful attentiveness of a man who is glad of what he sees. She tied her horse and walked up to him and stood beside him watching the creek for a moment, and then she said, "I need to tell you something." "All right," he said. "I told you I didn't want promises," she said. "And you made me one anyway. You said you'd still be here on your land, whatever I decided about my life. You said it was just a true thing, not a promise." "I remember," he said. "You've kept it," she said. "For more than a year, you've kept that one not quite promise without ever asking me for anything in return, without pushing the fences, without trying to convince me of anything I wasn't ready for." She stopped. She made herself continue. "I think I've been in love with you for quite some time. I think I've been pretending I wasn't because being in love with someone means they can hurt you, and I had decided I was done being hurt." Henry was very still. "But the other thing I've realized," she said, "is that refusing to be hurt also means refusing to be loved, and I'm tired of that arrangement. I don't want it anymore." She looked at him directly. "I still don't want empty promises. I still don't want to be someone's idea of what a woman should be. But I think what you've been offering me, what you've actually been offering consistently for all this time, is none of those things." He looked at her with those steady dark eyes, and she could see in them what Clara had described, and what she had, honestly, been able to see for months if she'd let herself look. She had just not let herself look. "Jennie," he said. He said it the way people say the names of things they have wanted for a long time and are now finally allowed to reach for. "I love you. I have for, honestly, probably since September of last year, but possibly earlier. I love you in the specific way of knowing someone well enough to understand what makes them difficult and finding that I love those parts too." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, and he covered it with his hand, and she felt the roughness of his skin and the warmth of it, and the solidity of him standing there in the September light by the creek they had walked along for a year and a half. "I love you too," she said. "And I want you to know that my saying so is the most terrifying thing I've done since leaving Abilene." "I'll be careful with it," he said. "You know I will." She did know. That was the whole of it. She knew it in the specific way you know things that have been demonstrated rather than declared, not from one grand moment but from 100 ordinary ones, from Thursday mornings and Saturday evenings, and October grass and January storms, and a garden along the south wall planted in early May. He kissed her there on the creek bank with the cottonwoods overhead, and the water running its indifferent and beautiful course beside them. And it was the kind of kiss that doesn't try to be more than it is, warm and honest and exactly sufficient. Fall of 1875 moved through Callow Creek with the amber and copper quality that Texas falls have when they are being generous. The cattle market held steady. Henry's first full season on his own land turned a modest profit that he recorded in his ledger with the satisfaction of a man who is seeing something he built begin to work. And Jennie and Henry moved through the town together in the open way of people who have stopped pretending to be something other than what they are. Callow Creek, for its part, received this information with the measured reaction of a town that had been watching the situation develop for 18 months and considered itself well ahead of the news. Mrs. Greer said simply, "About time," which was the most succinct she had ever been about anything. The Reverend Prout smiled in the careful way of a man who wants to say "I told you so," but is restrained by his profession. Martha Delacroix, the schoolteacher, celebrated with a frankness that was entirely characteristic, declaring at the women's sewing circle that Henry Barnett was the finest man in the county, and anyone who had eyes could see they were perfectly matched. They took things at their own pace, which was something Henry seemed to understand instinctively was important. He did not immediately begin suggesting futures. He let the fact of their love settle into the shape of their lives the way water settles into stone, gradually and completely, and without force. They spent Sundays on the land together as often as they could, and Henry began to show her more of what he envisioned for the place. A larger garden, a second pasture opened when he could afford the fence, eventually a proper second room added to the house when the time came that a second room was necessary. He never said the last part directly. He simply included it in his long-range thinking and let her hear it as a matter-of-fact element of the future he was building. And she heard it and she did not object, and they both understood what that meant. In November, he proposed. He did it in the kitchen of the Carver house. His house, on a Sunday evening when they had cooked supper together, with the easy familiarity of people who have been in kitchens together enough times to have a natural rhythm about it. He had made biscuits, which he was surprisingly good at, and she had managed the venison stew that Louis's mother had taught her, which had come out better than her first 3 attempts, and they had eaten at the small table by the window with the night coming down blue-black outside, and the lamp between them casting its warm circle. He had washed the dishes, which was something he always did, and she had dried them, which was something she always did, and when the last one was put away he turned to her and leaned against the counter and looked at her with the expression she had come to know as his thinking of something expression. "Jennie," he said. "Henry," she said. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I want to do it in the full knowledge of everything you've told me about what you don't want and what you've been through and what cost you the most." She set down the dish towel and looked at him. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because I want to make you something, or because I expect you to become smaller to fit into what marriage is supposed to look like, but because I want to build this life with you, all of it with your name next to mine on the land deed, and your opinions in the room when decisions get made, and your presence in this house as something permanent and chosen rather than something we're still deciding about." He paused. "I know you said you didn't want promises. I've tried not to make you empty ones. But I am making you this one. I will spend every year of my life proving that this is what I said it was." The kitchen was very quiet. The lamp moved slightly in the draft from the window. Jennie looked at him for a long time, and she thought about Wichita and Abilene and the train and the trunk, and the room above the dry goods store, and every Thursday, and every Saturday in October grass and Clara's voice, saying you deserve to be loved by someone good. And she thought about this man, this specific man, who had heard every single thing she'd said about what she didn't want and had honored every word of it, and had built something real and steady in the space between her terms and his own honest nature. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will." He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, and she was in his arms, and he held her with the specific warmth of a man holding onto something he plans to take very good care of, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt the solid beat of his heart and thought, "This is what safe feels like when it is also real." They were married in February of 1876, in the Callow Creek church with the Reverend Prout officiating, and Mrs. Greer weeping openly in the front pew, and Martha Delacroix sitting next to her maintaining a composure that lasted until the vows, at which point it also failed. Clara came down from Lawrence with Thomas and their new baby, a boy they'd named James, and she stood beside Jennie as the witness, and held her hand for a moment before the ceremony started and didn't say anything, which was the kindest possible thing. Henry stood at the front of the church in his best coat, which Jennie had pressed herself, and he watched her walk down the short aisle with the expression of a man who cannot believe his luck and also entirely can, because he has worked toward this thing with everything he had. Louis Casas stood with him as his witness, having managed in 8 months of working for Henry to become something closer to family than employee. Emilio Casas played the fiddle outside afterward, on the church steps in the February cold, and people danced in the street for a while despite the temperature, because in Callow Creek, a wedding was a civic occasion, and everyone felt some ownership of a good one. That evening, Jennie Barnett, she said the name to herself that night quietly, experimentally, and found that it fit without any pinching, sat on the porch of their house with Henry beside her, and the Texas night around them and the sound of cattle settling in the pasture and the distant sound of the creek, and she thought, I did not want this. I did not want promises or permanence or the particular vulnerability of being known completely, and here I am, and I was wrong, and being wrong has never felt so much like being right. What are you thinking? Henry asked. That I'm happy, she said, as if it still surprised her slightly. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat there a long time in the February dark until the cold made sitting outside unreasonable, and they went inside together. The first years of their marriage were the building years, and they built. Henry ran his cattle operation through the second season with enough success that he went back to Gerald Dunmore in the spring of 1877 and accepted a modified version of the partnership that was, by that point, even more in Henry's favor than the original offer had been, because Gerald Dunmore was a man who respected a rancher who could wait. The Dunmore partnership gave Henry access to a larger market and better trail connections, and the land absorbed the growth steadily, the way good land does. Jennie left Mrs. Greer's store in the spring of 1877, which she and Mrs. Greer both approached with the sentimentality of people who have come to mean something significant to each other, and are handling it in a practical register, because that is how both of them handle everything. Mrs. Greer gave her a length of fine wool and a long embrace, and said that the store had never run as well as it had since Jennie had come, which Jennie knew was partly true and partly kindness, and loved her for both. She had saved enough of her wages, added to what Henry had, that she had something of her own, a fact she insisted on maintaining even as they built a shared life, and Henry, being Henry, understood this entirely and kept the accounts in a way that made it clear what was hers specifically and what was shared. She set up a small trading practice from the house goods she sourced directly from suppliers, and sold to the various smaller operations in the area that couldn't always get into town. It was modest and entirely her own enterprise, and it grew slowly and steadily in the way of things that are well run. Their first child was born in October of 1877. A boy, which delighted Henry with the particular delight of a man who will love a daughter just as well but has secretly hoped for a son first, and which delighted Jennie because the boy arrived healthy and loud and looking, she thought with a private amusement, exactly like Henry. They named him Thomas Edwin Barnett, Thomas for Clara's husband who had been a steady kindness through their acquaintance, and Edwin for Henry's father. Thomas Edwin entered the world during a thunderstorm and conducted the first months of his life with the same dramatic energy, which Louis Casas said was a sign of a good temperament, and Dr. Farrow said was simply how babies are, and everyone managed. Henry held his son in the lamplit bedroom the night after he was born, the storm outside having quieted to a steady October rain, and he held him with the particular terror and tenderness of a new father who understands that he has just become responsible for something irreplaceable. Jennie watched from the bed, tired down to her bones and feeling, despite this, a fullness of something she had no precise word for, not happiness exactly, not contentment, but something larger and more complicated that contained both and a great deal more. "You are remarkable," Henry said, looking at her over the baby's head. "I've been telling you that for years," she said. He laughed and she laughed, and the baby startled at the sound and then settled again, and outside the rain came down on the Texas land they were building together. The years moved on with the particular rhythm of a life that is well-rooted, not without difficulty, because a cattle operation in Texas in the 1870s was never without difficulty, but without the kind of difficulty that breaks things. There were seasons of drought that required careful management and seasons of flooding that required the same. There were years when the cattle market softened and years when it strengthened, and Henry navigated both with the steadiness he brought to everything. The partnership with Dunmore deepened into something that benefited both operations genuinely, and Gerald Dunmore, who was now well past 70 and had no sons of his own, had taken to saying publicly that Henry Barnett was the best rancher in the county, which was a thing that carried weight coming from Gerald Dunmore. Jennie's trading practice grew into something that required real bookkeeping and a correspondence with 3 separate suppliers. She knew, by 1879, every significant cattle and goods operation within 40 miles of Callow Creek by name and need and reliability, and she had the reputation of a businesswoman who could be dealt with honestly, which is the most valuable reputation in commerce. Henry was proud of her in the specific way he was proud of everything she did, not because it reflected on him, but because it was genuinely admirable on its own terms, and he told her so. They had a daughter in the spring of 1879. They named her Rosa May Barnett. She arrived with the spring wildflowers and the urgency of the creek running high, delivered by Dr. Farrow in the now expanded main bedroom of a house that had grown 2 rooms and a covered porch since Henry had bought it in 1874. Rosa was small and fierce and looked like Jennie in every detail, which Henry declared immediately, and which Jennie denied, and which was entirely obvious to anyone who cared to look. Clara came to visit for a month that summer and held Rosa and played with Thomas Edwin, who was by now 18 months old, and conducting himself with the determined independence of a child who has decided that walking is the minimum acceptable standard and is attempting to run, and the house was full in the way that full houses are full, loud and warm and somewhat chaotic, and entirely alive. On the last evening of Clara's visit, she and Jennie sat on the porch while Henry and Thomas and Clara's husband, and their now 3-year-old James, occupied the yard with some game that involved sticks and a great deal of running. Jennie was nursing Rosa, and the evening light was the specific Callow Creek gold that she had come to regard as one of the most beautiful things she knew. "Do you remember," Clara said, "the letter you sent me from Abilene right before you left?" "I remember," Jennie said. "You said you were done with love," Clara said. "You said you were going to find a place and build something of your own and you didn't need anything else." I remember that too, Jennie said. You found a place, Clara said. Jennie looked out at the yard where Henry was explaining something to Thomas and Clara's James with the patient attention he brought to children as naturally as he brought it to everything else, crouching down to their level with his elbows on his knees. And Thomas Edwin was watching his father's face with the focused trust of a child who believes his father can explain any mystery in the world. I found a place, Jennie agreed. And I found Henry. She paused. Who was patient enough to wait for me to find myself first. He's a good man, Clara said. The best I've met, Jennie said, simply and entirely. And I have been quite specific about what good means. The summer of 1880 brought a development that changed the shape of Callow Creek permanently. The railroad was extended, not through the town directly, but close enough that a spur line was proposed, and the town meetings that accompanied this news were the most heated that Callow Creek had produced since the water rights debates of 1873. Henry was on the town council by this time, a position he'd been asked to take on by enough people that declining felt irresponsible, and he managed the railroad discussions with the same unhurried steadiness that characterized everything he did. The spur line was approved. It came through the southern edge of town by the following spring. The effect on Callow Creek was immediate and significant. The cattle market access improved dramatically, which benefited every ranching operation in the area, including Henry's, and the town itself began to grow with the energy of a place that has been given an external connection to a larger world. Jennie's trading operation, which had been doing well on limited infrastructure, expanded significantly with better transportation. She brought on a part-time bookkeeper, a young woman named Dolores Ray's daughter of Augustin the blacksmith, who had a talent for numbers and whom Jennie mentored with the specific attention of a woman who has been underestimated herself and knows the cost of it. By 1882, Henry had bought the adjacent 20 acres from an estate sale, a neighbor who had died without heirs, bringing his land to 62 acres, which was a proper operation by anyone's measure. Louis Casas had been with them 8 years by this point, and was as much a fixture of the Barnett place as the barn itself. He had married a woman from a family in town, a quiet and capable woman named Petra, and Henry had built them a proper small house on the east edge of the property, which Louis had accepted with the straightforward gratitude of a man who does not make his feelings into a spectacle. Thomas Edwin was 5 years old, and had opinions about cattle that he expressed with a confidence that made his father laugh. Rosa was 3, and had opinions about everything that she expressed with a confidence that her father said came directly from her mother, which Jennie received as the compliment it was intended to be. One evening in the fall of 1882, when the children were asleep, and the house was quiet in the specific way that a house with small children is quiet when they sleep intensely, gratefully, Jennie and Henry sat on the porch in the chairs he had made himself from good oak, and the night was the full Texas darkness that had nothing between them and the stars. "Henry," she said. "Jennie," he said, "do you remember what you said to me on the night you proposed?" He was quiet for a moment, not because he was trying to remember, she knew, but because he was deciding how to answer. "I said I would spend every year of my life proving that this was what I said it was," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "You have," she said. "I want you to know that you have, every year, every single one." She paused. "When I told you I didn't want promises, I meant it. But what I didn't know then, what I had to learn, is that there's a difference between a promise said to quiet someone and a promise made as a description of what's actually going to happen." She looked at him in the dark. "Yours was always the second kind." Henry was quiet for a moment. She could see in the dim starlight the movement of something in his face that was too complex for a single word. "I wasn't going to be anything other than what I said I was," he said. "That was the only thing I knew for certain about myself that first year. Everything else was hope, but that part I knew." She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand in his, and he closed his fingers around it in the way that had become as familiar as breathing and remained, somehow, just as necessary. They sat in the dark of their land and listened to the sounds of it, the cattle in the near pasture, the creek somewhere in the distance doing its constant work, the wind in the grass that went all the way to the horizon, and above it all the enormous Texas sky with its preposterous abundance of stars, the same sky that had been above this land before either of them came to it, and would be above it long after. Indifferent and beautiful and entirely unhelpful about the small human matters of love and fear and the long work of proving a thing true. But the small human matters were, Jennie thought, the whole story. They were everything. The following spring, their third child arrived. Another boy, which Thomas Edwin regarded with the mixed feelings of a 6-year-old who had enjoyed being the only boy for some time, and Rosa regarded with the complete indifference of a 4-year-old who had her own agenda. They named him William Francis Barnett, William for no particular reason except that it suited him the moment they saw him, and Francis for Jennie's father, which was a bridge she had been quietly building with her parents over several years of letters and one long visit, a bridge that had not become what it once was but had become something real and navigable, which was enough. William Francis arrived healthy and remained so, and grew with the particular eagerness of a child born into a family that has found its shape and is comfortable in it. Life on the Barnett land moved forward with the steady rhythm of things that are well tended. The children grew with the Texas years, Thomas Edwin tall and serious like his father, Rosa sharp and entrepreneurial like her mother in ways that both delighted and occasionally challenged the patience of the school system. Young William Francis acquiring a talent for animals that Louis Casas said was the most natural he'd seen since his own childhood. Mrs. Greer retired from the dry goods store in 1884 and sold it to Dollars Rays and her husband, which Jennie had helped quietly facilitate because she believed in Dollars' capability completely and understood what it cost a woman to try to own something in a world that was not always organized to allow it. Mrs. Greer retired to a small house she'd bought near the church and spent her considerable energy on the Church Women's Society and her garden and a correspondence with her sister in Georgia, and a sustained campaign to ensure that everyone in Callow Creek was adequately fed at all times, which occupied her as effectively as the store ever had. Augustin Rays, now in his 60s, had passed the blacksmith work largely to his eldest son and spent his time on the civic business of the town, sitting on the same council as Henry and bringing to it the same unhurried intelligence that had always made him someone people listened to. Callow Creek in 1885 was larger than it had been in 1874 and smaller than it would become, and was, in the judgment of most of the people who lived there, exactly the right size for the purposes of a life. Henry turned 38 in the spring of 1885, and Jennie turned 35, and the land was 62 acres, and the cattle herd numbered 112 head, and the barn had been repaired and expanded, and the house had 4 rooms and a kitchen that Jennie had organized to within an inch of its life, and the vegetable garden along the south wall was in its 10th year and had become something of a landmark for the neighborhood. On the morning of his birthday, Jennie came out to the barn where he was with Thomas Edwin, who at 8 years old considered himself a genuine hand on the operation, and was largely right about this, and she stood in the barn doorway in the spring light and watched her husband showing their son the correct way to assess a hoof for tenderness, patient and specific, not talking down to the child, but also not pretending the child already knew what he was learning. Henry looked up and saw her, and smiled the full smile that changed his face, the one she had counted in the early days before she let herself stop counting and simply let herself have it. "Mama," Thomas Edwin said, "Papa's teaching me the hoof check." "Is he being patient about it?" Jennie asked. "He always is," Thomas Edwin said, with the certainty of a child stating a law of nature. Jennie looked at her husband across the barn, with the morning light coming through the gaps in the plank walls in gold bars. And she thought of a woman who had arrived in a town with one trunk, and the firm conviction that promises were the most expensive thing she could afford. And she thought about everything that had been built since then. The barn and the house and the children and the years, and the specific, accumulated weight of being loved well by a man who had meant every word he'd ever said to her. She crossed the barn and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her easily, naturally, in the way of a man who has done it for 9 years and expects to do it for a great many more. And she leaned her shoulder against his, and they stood together watching their son work on the hoof check with the focused intensity of a child determined to get it right. "Happy birthday," she said quietly. "Best one yet," he said, which was what he said every year. She had stopped telling him that wasn't how mathematics worked, because she had come to believe he might be right. Summer moved through the land in its long golden way, and the children played in the pasture in the evenings, and Rosa organized the other children in Callow Creek into enterprises of varying ambition, and Thomas Edwin ran the fence checks with a reliability that Louis Casas said was worth a wage, and William Francis acquired a dog he named Marshall, which was either a statement or a coincidence. And the Barnett family continued to be exactly what Henry had said it was going to be, specific and real, and daily in the way of things that are built carefully and meant to last. In September of 1885, the 11th anniversary of Jennie's arrival in Callow Creek, she walked the east bank of the creek alone on a Saturday evening, the same creek bank she and Henry had walked together so many times that she knew every root and bend of it. She had left him at the house with the children, who were involved in something complicated with a rope and a bucket that she had decided not to investigate too closely. The cottonwoods were beginning to turn. The creek ran low in September, as it always did, quiet over its stones, and the evening light lay on it in the way that makes water look like something precious. She stood for a while and simply listened to it, and she thought about the woman who had stood here the first time, guarded and clear-eyed and sure of what she did not want, and much less sure of what she did. She thought about the courage it had taken to say yes, the specific courage of someone who has been hurt before and chooses to believe that hurt is not the whole story. She thought about the long, slow process of learning to trust, not blindly, not by abandoning judgment, but by accumulating evidence that a thing is what it says it is, one Thursday and one Saturday and one quiet year at a time. Henry came along the bank behind her. She heard his footsteps in the dry grass, unhurried as always, and felt his presence before she saw him, because she had been aware of the particular quality of his nearness for so long that it had become a kind of sense. "I thought you were managing the bucket situation," she said. "Louis took over," he said. He came and stood beside her the way he always had, looking at the water. "I figured you might want company." "I might," she said. They were quiet together for a while, which was one of the things she valued most about him. The way their silences were never uncomfortable, never full of anything that needed to be said and wasn't. They were simply the natural pauses of two people who know each other well enough to be at ease in the same space without noise. "I was thinking about when we met," she said, "when you first came into the store. I was hoping you'd notice me," he said. "I tried not to make it obvious," she laughed. "You didn't try very hard." "I tried moderately," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "I told you I didn't want promises," she said. "You did," he said, "and you made me one anyway." "I did," he said. "Are you angry about it?" She turned and looked at him, this man she had spent 11 years building a life with, whose hands she knew and whose laugh she knew and whose silences she knew and whose patience she had relied on and whose love she had allowed herself to have in full finally, without the reserve she had maintained for so long. "No," she said, "I'm not angry. I spent years proving I meant it," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "I noticed." He looked at her with the expression that was still, after 11 years, capable of doing something to her chest, the specific expression of a man who is exactly where he intended to be and entirely certain of it. Was it enough? He asked, and there was something in the question that was not uncertain. He knew the answer but was simply asking because it was good to hear. She stepped closer to him, and he put his arms around her, and she stood in the warmth of him in the September evening with the creek running its low, faithful course beside them, and she thought of all the ways the word enough was entirely insufficient for what she felt. More than enough, she said. It was everything. He pressed his lips to her hair, and they stood there a long time in the evening, and the creek went on, and the cottonwoods whispered above them, and the land that they had built together stretched in every direction, solid and real, and full of a future that was still becoming itself. Rosa growing into a young woman with her mother's mind and her father's patience. Thomas Edwin already showing the rancher's instinct that would make him exceptional. William Francis running through the pasture with his dog in the late light. A family, a life, a thing made from two people who had been willing to show up honestly and remain, day after day, exactly what they said they were. She had said she wanted no promises. He had made her one anyway, and he had spent every year since proving he meant it, in the particular way of a man who understands that love is not a declaration but a practice built in ordinary days and honest words, and the keeping of small promises that accrue, over years, into something so large and so solid that it has become the ground you stand on. She had been right once, that she didn't need promises. She had been wrong that she didn't want this one, and she had been wise enough eventually to know the difference. The evening deepened around them, the Texas stars beginning their slow appearance one by one above the cottonwoods, and from the direction of the house came the sound of children's voices and Louis's laughter and the smell of Petra's cooking drifting across the land. And all of it was real, and all of it was theirs, and all of it had been built on the one promise she hadn't asked for and couldn't imagine now having lived without. Henry held her, and she let herself be held, and the creek ran on.